Secretary Letitia perked up her small ears and, pretending to water the flowers, edged closer to the boss's office. Something interesting was happening behind those doors today. Since the morning, Letitia had been engrossed in her usual duties. She played an online game, had 2 cups of coffee, chatted with an acquaintance from the neighboring real estate agency, and exchanged flirty glances with the boss. In general, there was no sign of anything unusual, as they say. Alberto Garcia arrived at work right on time. Letitia had managed to touch up her lips and even take a short nap in the comfortable office chair. "Good morning," the man absent-mindedly greeted as he disappeared into his office. "Morning," Letitia replied, watching his sturdy figure. Tapping her fingernails on the desk, she stood up and peeked into the office. "Would you like some coffee?" Alberto looked up from the document he was studying intently, blinked a few times. No, Letitia, I don't drink coffee." He sighed. "Did you prepare the agreement project for Morales?" The girl raised her eyes to the ceiling. "Morales?" she asked. "Hoops, completely slipped my mind. I'll take care of it now." Alberto frowned. "Letitia, what happened to your memory? Take notes. Get a daily planner, for heaven's sake." The secretary shot a displeased look at her boss. She hadn't come here to deal with boring documents. She had been recommended for this position by one of her friends, Carmen Moreno. After working for lawyer Garcia for 2 years, Carmen had unexpectedly married a well-off man, become pregnant, and passed her job on to Letitia. "Letitia, there are plenty of good guys here. Every client is a potential catch. And our boss is the best divorce attorney. You can't just walk in off the street. And the fees are decent, you know?" Alberto Garcia, accustomed to the somewhat flighty but efficient Carmen Moreno, succumbed to his former employee's persuasion and hired Letitia. Now, the lawyer was tormented, trying to figure out how to get rid of this nuisance. The new secretary had no intention whatsoever of fulfilling her duties and was engaged in anything but the tasks assigned to her. Of course, he could have fired Letitia, but every time he tried to firmly show the lazy woman the door, something stopped him. So, for the past 2 months, the lawyer's affairs were in a state of creative chaos, and the secretary happily sat in the office, earning a decent salary. "I will definitely talk to her today," Garcia decided, realizing that he would have to prepare the Morales agreement himself. After dealing with the current documents, Alberto decisively stood up, straightened his pants, and headed to the reception area. "Letitia, come in." The man hesitated. The secretary was not there. "Fine," Garcia thought irritably. "I'll wait for her and then fire her." Leaning on the desk, Alberto crossed his long legs and folded his arms across his chest. After waiting for 10 minutes, the lawyer started losing his patience. He glanced at the clock with dissatisfaction, furrowing his brows. The door swung open, and Letitia entered the reception area carrying a shopping bag from the nearby shopping center. Alberto's frown deepened. "Ho, boss." The secretary showed no sign of embarrassment. "I was out buying a daily planner." "That's unnecessary now," Garcia decided, determined not to deviate from his goal. "Actually, I was just about to talk to you." "Talk? About what?" The man was slightly thrown off by the girl's tone and hesitated for a moment. Just then, a woman with a vaguely familiar face entered the reception area. "Hello, Alberto," she whispered almost inaudibly. The visitor's eyes were feverishly gleaming. "Good day?" Alberto nodded politely. Do you have an appointment? Letitia asked in a slightly snippy voice, gearing up for an interesting conversation with her boss. The young secretary was convinced that her attractive boss had finally noticed her and was about to ask Letitia out on a date. Letitia, Garcia interrupted the secretary with an icy tone, and the girl pursed her lips in offense, giving an unfriendly look to the visitor. Calberto, you probably don't remember me. I'm Marisol Alonso. We've worked together twice. Yes, of course. First the divorce, then the marriage contract. Is that right? The woman nodded in response. Well, now I have contract issues. Do you understand? Can we talk? Marisol glanced at the secretary. Garcia invitingly opened the door to his office. The thing is, Marisol settled into a chair and pulled a folder of documents from her bag. After the divorce, as you may remember, I decided not to enter into a new marriage until I signed a contract. Alberto rummaged through his memory, recalling the circumstances of the case. Marisol was quite wealthy, the owner of a chain of hotels. The first time she got married was to a classmate, an early marriage with immature spouses. Marisol's husband turned out to be completely unsuited for family life. While Marisol was studying and working part-time, her husband was lounging on the couch, dreaming up business projects. He got into debt several times, trying to launch his own business, but each time it ended in failure. Marisol struggled to distribute money to creditors. Eventually, when she became pregnant and gave birth, the family was on the brink of survival. Barely spending 2 months at home with her young daughter, Marisol dove back into work, simultaneously trying to open her first hotel. With incredible determination, she quickly organized her own business, albeit a small one. Over the next few years, the small hotel grew into a thriving chain. Meanwhile, her husband, who had no intention of working, took a mistress. Naturally, he accused Marisol of infidelity. For Marisol, news of her husband's affair was the last straw, and she filed for divorce. But that's when the real problems began. Since Marisol had started her business while still married, her husband wanted to split the hotel chain in half. Taken aback by his audacity, Marisol turned to Alberto Garcia, who was a budding but already well-known divorce attorney at the time. Alberto grimaced, recalling the rather unpleasant man he had to deal with. Garcia handled it brilliantly, and in the end, the ex-husband received a rather small settlement and vanished across the country. Marisol sighed in relief. The case was won, but it had consumed more than enough of her nerves. When a new man entered Marisol's life and proposed to her, she immediately turned to Garcia, asking him to draft a perfect prenuptial agreement. I love Carlos, the woman explained with a slight blush. But you see, when I think about my divorce experience, it makes me uneasy. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Garcia reassured her. Our system of prenuptial agreements isn't very developed yet, but sooner or later, we'll get there. After all, it's a very practical practice. The law is imperfect, and it's very difficult to cover all the nuances, so a contract can definitely make life easier. Besides, you're not trying to take anything away. You just want to protect what's yours. Yes, exactly. I've worked hard for a long time to provide for myself and my child. You see, as long as Carlos and I are together, everything will be shared anyway. And he's not against it himself. Garcia suddenly raised an eyebrow. Not opposed, the lawyer thought. Considering the cultural context, given our reality, one of the partners is usually offended by such a proposal. Well, then, Alberto asked his client about the specific points she wanted to include in the agreement and scheduled a meeting with the future spouses in a few days. Carlos Alonso made a mixed impression. The man looked neat, even well-groomed, wearing a slightly flashy dark purple suit, a black shirt, and gold cufflinks. Surprisingly, the outfit suited him. Carlos himself had black hair, thick eyebrows, and a refined nose, with a tiny diamond glinting in his earlobe. Marisol herself didn't shine with brightness. She was attractive, but her beauty required a closer look to appreciate. Very delicate and smooth facial features seemed to have been drawn with pastel chalk, complemented by reddish wavy hair, warm tiny freckles, and an elegant figure. In general, in the lawyer's eyes, the couple seemed to embody the saying opposites attract. Well, I've prepared a template for the agreement, but we need to include your assets, Carlos. The lawyer looked at Marisol's fiancé. According to the contract, in the event of divorce or the death of one of the spouses, the property remains separate. However, we'll add certain clauses that, based on them, certain assets acquired during the marriage will still be subject to division. Let's see what we can include in the agreement from your side at the moment. Carlos, who looked like a typical businessman, turned out to be Poe. His possessions consisted of an old car and a garage. No real estate, business, or even a vacation home. Trying not to show surprise, Alberto asked where Marisol's future husband worked. I'm a man, Carlos retorted with hidden contempt, glancing at the lawyer, and I have a normal, manly job. Alberto quickly glanced at Alonso's well-groomed, white hands and inwardly smirked. Marisol seemed a bit embarrassed. Carlos works as a lathe operator at the factory. The woman provided the exact workplace of her fiancé. Garcia nearly choked on the tea he had just sipped from his cup. A lathe operator, Alberto calmly tapped away on his laptop keyboard, entering information about Alonso's assets into the agreement. Where have you seen lathe operators like that? I'd sooner believe he's a gypsy baron. Well, perhaps he dressed up for the visit to the lawyer. Garcia mused to himself. The prenuptial agreement was drafted according to all the rules. Carlos stated that he had no relatives, so in any case, his inheritance would go to Marisol after his death. Garcia nodded. I understand, but unforeseen situations can arise, so an inheritance clause is necessary, Alberto suggested. Of course, Alonso smirked. Everything should be by the rules. The main thing is for Marisol to be at ease. Marisol sighed and took her fiancé's hand. This is how their last meeting with Garcia was etched in his memory. And now, a thoroughly distressed Marisol was sitting in front of him again. Carlos, you see, there was an accident at the factory where he worked. You've probably heard about the explosion, the fire, dozens of casualties, and several deaths. She began. Garcia became alert. Did this Alonso really work as a lathe operator? So, Carlos was right in the epicenter. The woman continued. He died on the spot. His body was badly burned in the fire. She sobbed softly. It was awful. Alberto offered the client a box of tissues, and as some commotion could be heard outside the door, he grew wary. The drawn-out voice of Letitia, which had recently been giving Garcia a headache, was audible. Where are you going? I told you there was a meeting there. The door was jerked a few times back and forth, but eventually, it swung open. A petite, red-haired girl walked briskly into the room. Hello, she greeted Garcia with a displeased tone. Good day. The man raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alberto, I told her not to come. Letitia pouted. breezed into Garcia's office, followed by the stranger. "Oh, Alberto, I apologize." Marisol blushed. "This is my daughter, Olivia." The woman lowered her voice and addressed her daughter indignantly. "Why did you come here?" Olivia cast a glance around the office and stared at Garcia, who felt a shiver run down his spine under her unfriendly gaze. "Oh, so you're the one who drafted that useless contract, aren't you?" she said with a smirk. The girl raised an eyebrow. The lawyer nodded calmly. "That's right." He turned to Marisol. "You've been having some issues with the agreement. We didn't get to that point before." Marisol hesitated. "Since Carlos' death, half a year has passed. According to our prenuptial agreement, spouses do not inherit from each other. Well, there's not much to inherit anyway. And honestly, I went to the notary with the contract just to formalize things. After all, Carlos has no relatives. But he does have relatives." Olivia pouted, settling into a chair. "He's got a whole camp of them." Marisol slapped her palm on the coffee table. "Daughter, be quiet, please, when adults are talking." "I'm 23. Olivia pouted her lower lip. "That doesn't matter." Marisol, usually gentle with her loved ones, suddenly switched to her professional, authoritative tone, and her daughter fell silent. Garcia listened intently. He had encountered distant relatives suddenly appearing and claiming inheritance before. But why did Marisol have such bad luck? In her first marriage, her husband tried to take everything, and in the second, it was her husband's relatives. It turned out that when Marisol went to the notary, she learned the news that 3 more people wanted to join the inheritance. 2 children from Carlos' first marriage and his mother. Marisol presented the notary with a prenuptial agreement listing the deceased husband's assets. But the newfound relatives immediately filed a lawsuit. One of Alonso's daughters was disabled, and his mother was a pensioner. In their opinion, they had the right to a mandatory share of the inheritance. And of course, the old car and garage didn't interest them. In short, I was sued for half of all the property and the business. Supposedly, according to the contract, I have no inheritance rights, but they get exactly half of the common assets. Can you believe it? Since they are first-degree heirs. Garcia covered his eyes with his palm. Was this deja vu? Were they trying to take everything Marisol had earned again? "All right, listen." The lawyer ruffled his wavy hair. "It's an unpleasant case, but we'll easily prove the invalidity of their claims in court. That's it. Of course, I'd prefer to avoid a lawsuit." Marisol stopped Garcia with a gesture. "But the issue is not only about that. Or rather, not only about that." She sighed. Marisol told how, during the meeting with her late husband's relatives, she had tried to negotiate with them herself. "I'm sure I'll win in court." Alonso tried to convince the 3 aggressively disposed women. "And if you lose, you'll have to cover all the legal expenses. Do you understand?" "Cunning woman," the mother of the deceased man protested. "By law, we're entitled to it. Since when do you think you'll win?" The lawyer said the law is on our side. For a while, Marisol tried to persuade the stubborn relatives, but they were unwilling to give up their positions. Waving her hand, she ended the meeting. As Marisol Alonso was leaving the meeting place, she dropped her phone. The gadget bounced off the floor and landed behind a huge tub with a palm tree. Sighing, she squatted down, trying to reach for the mobile. It was precisely at that moment that Marisol overheard the conversation of the newfound relatives. "How could he change so much, grandmother?" one of the daughters asked. "I have no idea, judging by the photos. That's not Carlos at all." "What difference does it make?" Maybe it's just someone with the same last name. Well, if it was someone with the same last name, the passport data wouldn't match, the second daughter reasonably noted. But something doesn't add up here. I don't care. I crossed Carlos out of my life a long time ago. Right now, the main thing is to get the money. Marisol listened to this conversation with her heart pounding. She remembered that during the first meeting at the notary's office, as a gesture of goodwill, she had brought several photos of her late husband for his relatives to help choose a picture for a memorial. She had found it strange at the time how amazed Alonso's daughters looked at the photos. His mother, however, remained completely unaffected. Garcia raised an eyebrow. Now, this is truly interesting. Perhaps these people have nothing to do with your husband at all. If we can prove this and present arguments, we may not have to take the case to court. Olivia frowned and looked displeasedly at the lawyer. And if you had initially prepared a proper agreement, then Alberto finally couldn't hold back and gave the girl a venomous smile. Olivia, the prenuptial agreement was drafted according to all the rules. If it comes to court, believe me, I'll win. But it's always better not to let it escalate to a trial, not to waste time and resources. And I am confident in my work. Trust me. In fact, Marisol spoke up. I've come to realize that Carlos was really not who he pretended to be. Where do these conclusions come from? Garcia wondered, and Marisol began to explain. The overheard conversation continued to trouble Marisol. Later that same night, she delved into the social media profiles of the relatives. One of the daughters had an entire album dedicated to childhood photos. Among them were pictures from the maternity ward and scanned Polaroid photos from home gatherings. Everywhere, next to a slender, gloomy brunette, was the same man. Tall, with thick hair and bright blue eyes. I understand that this is the real Carlos Alonso, Marisol declared. But then who was my husband? And where is the person whose identity he lived under? What does it matter, Mom? The main thing is that your husband was a deceiver. I've always said he was a shady character. I still want to know who I lived with for nearly 5 years. Garcia was slightly taken aback. I'm not a private detective. How can I help in this situation? I would really like you to represent my interests in this lawsuit. You know what the relatives have filed. Marisol explained, sensing an unspoken question in the lawyer's eyes. I know how sharp your mind is. Maybe in a conversation with them, you'll get some leads. I need something to start with, you understand? I must find out what's behind this strange story. True, all these relatives have already gone back home, but it's a neighboring town, not too far away. I don't mind taking on your case. Garcia nodded. But I'm not an investigator. Do you understand that? With a smile, Marisol placed a folder in front of the lawyer. Here is everything I could find on my own. Please take a look. Alberto took the folder and bid farewell to the visitors politely. Goodbye. Olivia responded venomously as she left, followed by her mother. What a witch, Garcia thought, watching the girl leave. Though quite attractive. Boss. Letitia peeked into the office, still carrying a trace of resentment on her face. You wanted to talk about something, didn't you? Oh yes, Letitia, you see, I suddenly realized that you can't handle the enormous workload that exists in our organization. Letitia smiled joyfully. Do you want to hire an assistant for me? What? The lawyer stared at the audacious secretary. No, absolutely not. Isabel, who worked here before you, managed to handle all the tasks. And it seems to me that you simply lack experience. Letitia, perhaps you should start your career with something simpler. That's what I began this conversation for. What do you mean, boss? I don't understand. Are you transferring me or something? I'm firing you, not transferring you. Letitia, you are fired. You didn't pass your probation period. I'm sorry. You can pick up your documents tomorrow. Is that clear? Letitia covered her mouth with her hand and rushed out of the office. There was a commotion, a crash, the sound of shattered glass. Alberto endured a surge of anxiety, remaining composed at his desk. Finally, there was the indignant click of heels, and the door slammed shut. Garcia sighed, wiping the cold sweat that had formed on his forehead. In all his 30 years of life, he had never fired anyone before. The experience felt quite unpleasant. It's interesting, a mocking voice sounded. If you can't even hire a proper secretary for yourself, what competence are you talking about? Alberto jerked his chin and looked at Olivia, who was standing in the doorway. Why are you here again? The lawyer asked the girl wearily. Well, I left my backpack in the reception. The girl shook the strap on her shoulder. And I also happened to witness a rather amusing scene. Mr. Lawyer, is it really possible to be so indecisive with subordinates? Let that not bother you. You don't work for me, Garcia retorted, flipping through a document in the folder for emphasis. Olivia shifted her weight from foot to foot and frowned. And maybe you'll hire me for work. What do you mean? Garcia was amazed. I'm actually looking for a job. I have experience, and I'm certainly better than your Letitia. The lawyer regarded the girl with skepticism. She looked quite young, not very tall, dressed in simple jeans, a sweater, sneakers, with a backpack slung over her shoulder. But determination was evident on her face. Garcia didn't know what to say. Agree, Olivia suddenly smiled broadly. But on one condition. In my employment record, I'll be listed as an assistant to the director, not a secretary. You set the probation period yourself. Deal? Deal. Then you can start. Letitia probably won't pass her tasks to you. So bring your documents for processing tomorrow. Sign all the necessary papers, and you can start sorting out the mess she left behind. Great. See you tomorrow then. To be honest, Marisol Alonso's case had piqued Garcia's interest. These relatives of the deceased didn't just show up out of nowhere. And if he really had stolen someone else's identity, where was the real Alonso? Garcia enjoyed puzzles and mysteries. Alberto quickly delved into the folder Marisol had brought him. The next morning, Olivia met Garcia outside his office door. The girl was clearly prepared for her first day of work. She was wearing a formal dress, and her red hair was clumsily braided, with thin wavy strands sticking out in different directions. Alberto chuckled, opened the door, and gestured for the newly appointed assistant to come in. All right, for now, sort through everything on the table. Then go to the HR department, and then come to me. I'll give you a task. Okay, boss, Olivia said and started organizing the papers. After observing her for a few seconds, Garcia shook his head and went back to his own office. Yesterday, he had thoroughly examined Marisol's materials. In addition to old family photos, the folder also contained printouts of conversations with some old friends of the real Carlos Alonso. The first correspondence was with someone named Diego Fernandez. Marisol wrote to him that her husband, Carlos Alonso, had tragically died at the factory and that she was planning a memorial evening. She asked Diego to tell her some interesting details from Alonso's past. Diego willingly shared stories about his old friend and even sent a few photos from their trips together. According to Fernandez, Carlos had disappeared from the radar a little over 5 years ago. The man deeply regretted not being able to meet with his old friend one last time. They used to spend leisure time together, fishing, being outdoors, even mountain trips. 7 years ago, Alonso got divorced. His daughters were already in college, living their own lives. So, the man who was left alone became more reclusive. But at some point, according to Fernandez, Carlos Alonso suddenly vanished. It turned out he had sold his apartment without telling his family anything and simply left somewhere. Fernandez lamented that Alonso had even remarried at some point, but hadn't informed his daughters or his own mother about it. The story sounded plausible. However, the unfamiliar, blue-eyed blonde man in the scent photos still contradicted the image of the passionate brunette Marisol had married. The rest of the correspondences contained consistent information. By the way, the real Alonso did indeed work as a lathe operator at a factory, just in a different city. However, Garcia was increasingly doubting whether the pseudo Carlos could have been employed in such a place. Alberto pressed the intercom button. "Olivia, come in." A couple of seconds later, the assistant entered the office with a brisk step. "Yes, boss. Have a seat." Garcia gestured towards the chair and said, "Now, tell me about your stepfather, in every detail, from your perspective." Olivia thought for a moment and began her narrative. When her mother divorced her father, Olivia was barely 17. She remembered Emilio as a completely peaceful but very lazy man, like a domestic cat. Perhaps at some point in his early youth, Emilio had ambitions and aspirations, but by the age of 37, he had become a complete couch potato. When Olivia was a little girl and Marisol had to urgently start working to support the family, Emilio temporarily looked after her. However, as soon as their financial situation improved slightly, a nanny and a housekeeper were brought into the family. Furthermore, Marisol had no desire to have another child with Emilio. She loved her daughter Olivia very much, but she didn't experience the full joys of motherhood. Olivia grew up to be an independent girl and, as she matured, she looked at her laid-back father with surprise. How could he not want to do something, achieve something in life? Even she, at 17, was making plans for an independent life. But Emilio had his own ideas about a bright future. He enjoyed good meals, slept well, and eventually fell in love with another woman. His lover was a little over 20, with a young son from a failed relationship. And when Marisol accidentally exposed the affair, she didn't cry. 17-year-old Olivia couldn't hold back. "Dad, I call you Dad too, but I can't remember you ever raising me. Yet you're a father figure to another boy. Huh? Don't compare. He's a boy. He needs a man's hand. And don't meddle in adult affairs." Olivia wasn't surprised at all. She had long perceived her father as an uninspired but self-loving being. Of course, he enjoyed the adoration of a young girl, showering her with expensive gifts, paying for her apartment rent. After the affair was exposed, there was an ugly divorce, during which Emilio tried to claim half of their property from his wife and daughter. "Boss, you've done a great job." Olivia concluded the first part of her story and smirked. Left without money, Emilio was immediately abandoned by his lover and disappeared. And frankly, I don't miss him. Seeing his trembling, greed-filled hands and bloodshot eyes, I didn't see anything familiar in that person. Can you imagine, boss? Olivia enrolled in college, and Marisol immersed herself in her work again, trying to recover from the betrayal. After all, she had lived with her Emilio for almost 19 years and loved him in her own way. About a year later, Carlos Alonso appeared. He stood out with his bright, sometimes even flamboyant appearance, which strangely enough, attracted women. He first appeared on the doorstep of one of Marisol's hotels during a hot summer. Marisol had long stopped dealing with day-to-day tasks herself, but once a month, she toured her hotels with a small audit. She checked the food in the restaurants, inspected several rooms, and observed the staff. This habit of control had been there since the inception of her business, and Marisol had no intention of getting rid of it. The owner of the hotel chain surveyed the lobby, and her gaze immediately fell upon a tall, masculine figure. Thanks to the air conditioning, a pleasant coolness reigned in the lobby. In the middle of the spacious hall, a fountain tinkled melodically, and amidst this oasis, lazily lounging on a sofa, was Carlos Alonso. He was dressed in a bright yellow shirt with rolled-up sleeves. His tan skin contrasted with the fabric of the thin shirt, and his long crossed legs were stretched out in front of him. Marisol herself didn't understand why she stared at the stranger so intently. After all, there were many visitors in her hotels. She turned to the reception desk and requested several key cards for the rooms. At that moment, the man strolled over slowly and stood next to her. Marisol glanced at the stranger and was about to continue her inspection, but, "I apologize." A velvety and low voice sounded. "Is my room ready? I've been waiting for quite a while." The receptionist immediately clicked on his mouse and checked something, looking astonished at the man. But he didn't dare to argue in the presence of the owner. "Yes, of course. It's been ready since 12 o'clock. Here's your key, please." And the receptionist placed the card on the counter. The man took the card and looked at Marisol with interest, as if she were glued to the spot. "Good day, madam. Are you here for business as well, or for leisure?" Marisol shrugged in response. She really didn't want to reveal her status. "I'm here only briefly," the stranger continued. "But if you're alone, would you like to join me for dinner?" Marisol was slightly taken aback. Men usually didn't have the habit of inviting her on a date so directly and spontaneously. Her unassuming appearance required more careful consideration, and her rather stern demeanor didn't inspire flirting. "I'm not against it," she agreed, blushing slightly, causing her freckles to stand out even more on her nose. "Well then, I'm delighted," the man replied with a half bow. "Let's meet right here at 7 in the evening." "Agreed." Marisol smiled and quickly walked away from the counter, trying to hide her excitement. She didn't go to inspect the rooms that day, and she didn't engage in work at all. Marisol rushed home and feverishly started choosing an outfit, styling her hair, and doing her makeup. In the evening, after spending an extra 10 minutes in the car, Marisol entered the lobby of her own hotel once again, her heart pounding. Wearing a pristine white linen suit, the stranger was already waiting for her. Dressed in a black silk shirt and white jeans, Carlos, as he introduced himself, looked even more exquisite the next evening. He truly stood out amidst other men. Their evening went splendidly. Carlos was gallant, sharing amusing stories and showing genuine interest in Marisol. By the end of dinner, Marisol was quite tired, and Carlos, a little melancholic, suggested, "I only have 2 more nights and 1 day left. Could you accompany me tomorrow as well?" He looked at Marisol with hope. Marisol agreed. The next evening, Carlos dressed even more elegantly, in a black silk shirt and white jeans. He truly looked exotic compared to other men. Alonso appeared fresh and well-groomed. He told Marisol that he worked in a real man's job as a lathe operator at a factory and had come here on a business trip. They lathe operator on a business trip? Garcia was astonished. Well, Mom never really cared about his job, to be honest. Olivia shrugged. I doubt she knows what a lathe operator actually does. After spending a wonderful evening together, the couple exchanged phone numbers, and endless calls and messages ensued. My dear, it's so lonely without you. I lie here alone, gazing into the endless sky. It's rainy and gray today, but your mere existence paints the world in bright colors for me. Carlos wrote to her. Carlos, you can always come to me. You know, I miss you very much too. Marisol replied. Several months of long-distance relationship didn't dampen their passion. One beautiful day, Carlos returned to Marisol's hometown, and this time, they didn't part for a single moment. Olivia watched her joyful mother with mild surprise. On one hand, she was happy for Marisol, but on the other hand, a sense of concern crept into Olivia's heart. This feeling intensified when Marisol invited her daughter to a restaurant to introduce her to Alonso. Well, you saw him, didn't you? Olivia rolled her eyes. He's like something out of a Brazilian carnival. His gold accessories, bright clothing. Garcia tactfully cleared his throat, silently agreeing with the girl. Alberto himself preferred a casual style of clothing, only donning a suit when necessary. But he never wore flashy colors or sparkles. And finally, Carlos couldn't bear the separation any longer and proposed that Marisol move in with him. She happily agreed, and her daughter Olivia started arranging the apartment her mother had given her to celebrate her acceptance into university. However, Olivia had no desire to live under the same roof as a stranger. Soon after, Carlos proposed to Marisol. She trembled as she told her daughter about how beautifully Carlos had organized everything. During a starlit walk accompanied by the sounds of a violin, Carlos had also dressed up for the occasion. However, Olivia had already grown accustomed to this style of her future stepfather. Then there was the episode with drawing up a prenuptial agreement. Olivia was present at a family dinner when her mother, somewhat shyly, told her fiancé about her desire to sign an agreement. She can talk all she wants about how Carlos was perfectly fine with it, Olivia declared. But that's not how it was. I saw his face twitch. Of course, he quickly recovered and agreed to the prenup. I already began to understand everything back then because it was clear that this guy was aiming for Mom's wealth, Olivia added. Garcia shrugged. Then came the wedding. A splendid affair, of course with a themed approach. Carlos couldn't pass up the opportunity to dress in extravagant outfits, and he even convinced the guests to do the same. I'll show you the photos later. Boss, you'll have a good laugh, Olivia said. Though I had to put on all of this myself too. Carlos came up with a Renaissance-themed wedding. Olivia didn't spend much time with her mother. She had moved into her own apartment and was focused on her studies. As always, Marisol worked diligently. She dedicated every free moment to building the newfound family happiness. Sometimes Olivia would visit her mother for a few days, and then she would witness an interesting sight. Carlos, always dressed in his finest attire, would head to work as a lathe operator at the factory every morning. However, Olivia coincidentally encountered Alonso several times during the workday. dressed to impress. Her stepfather would appear in upscale restaurants, art galleries, and shopping centers, always accompanied by a different companion, whom he would gallantly court. There's no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. Olivia chuckled. There's not much to present. I'm afraid that even if I captured everything on video and showed it to my mom, she'd come up with a perfectly logical explanation. If a lathe operator can go on frequent business trips, then explaining city strolls during work hours would be a piece of cake. And those companions, my mom would just say they were his colleagues from the factory. So, your relationship with him wasn't very good. You felt he wasn't entirely honest. The lawyer clarified. He's fake through and through. Olivia cut in. I have the impression that he never spoke a sincere word the entire time we knew each other. And I don't believe his factory job for a second. You understand? Well, let's assume that's easy to verify. Garcia made a note on his smartphone. Mom buried unidentified remains. They just reported that a certain number of people died. A certain number disappeared without a trace. And the numbers matched those who didn't return from their shift or hospital. That aside, I wanted to tell you about my stepdad's selflessness. Olivia's face contorted. Olivia always paid attention to jewelry. She didn't particularly enjoy wearing it herself, but she enjoyed looking at it. Marisol often gifted her beloved husband with another piece, knowing his love for all things shiny. I periodically saw my stepdad wearing a platinum ring with a black diamond, or an antique tie clip, and cufflinks. He had a collection of jewelry like a sheik, but after he died, there was nothing left. No rings, no necklaces. I mean, he couldn't have worn them all at once and gone to work at the factory, right? Makes sense. Garcia pondered. Maybe he put it all in a bank safe deposit box. We would have found out about that when we started dealing with the inheritance. And also, during their marriage, my mom gifted my stepdad at least 4 cars. And each time something unfortunate happened to them, supposedly, my stepdad would take the car to the repair shop. And then it turned out the car was completely wrecked. Can you imagine? How much does a brand new car from the dealership cost? Olivia twirled her finger in the air. And now imagine selling a car every year and then telling my mom that he supposedly crashed it. Olivia had once protested, asking if it wasn't time to stop acquiring cars in industrial quantities. If Carlos couldn't drive properly, he should take the bus, she told her mother. To which Marisol responded with yet another justification. My husband earns his own money at the factory, but their budget is shared, and she's not going to curtail his expenses. And what man can live without a car? So, even if they got divorced, Alonso wouldn't have left empty-handed. He probably had a separate account for his ill-gotten gains, maybe not even in his own name. Olivia had honestly sworn not to meddle in Marisol's family affairs anymore, although she had expected the marriage to end badly. Honestly, I didn't expect things to turn out the way they did. It ended in such a tragic way. The girl shuddered. And then, when I started connecting the dots, I suddenly thought that maybe my stepdad had orchestrated his own death. You see, I didn't tell my mom about this, or else she would have gone looking for her beloved. The lawyer made a few more notes on his phone. It's a murky story, but it's still unclear how the real Alonso is involved, and there's suspicion of actual criminal activity. Should we get involved in this? Alberto looked intently at Olivia. Not you, of course, but me. Don't downplay it, lawyer. I've heard about you, if you are interested. I also graduated from law school. and I know exactly how you handle cases. Garcia snorted. And how do I handle cases? Forgive me, my young friend. In property law and divorce proceedings, you're a pro. Olivia calmly replied. I know you have connections in the police and the prosecutor's office, among other places. Otherwise, where would you get such detailed investigations? First and foremost, let's find out if anyone at the factory knew the lathe operator, Alonso. Are we going to conduct an investigation? Excitement lit up in the girl's eyes. What do you mean we? Alberto was surprised. Your job is to sit in the reception area, prepare documents, and answer calls. That's a secretary's job. Olivia waved it off. I want to help you with the investigation. So I hired you to replace a fired secretary. The lawyer protested. But in the employment contract I signed today in the HR department, my position is listed as assistant to the manager. Olivia chuckled. Did you really think I would just sit at the reception? Boss, come on, you can even stop paying me a salary. Hire a receptionist and take me with you, please. Alberto parked an inconspicuous foreign car at the factory gate and got out. Following him was Olivia, who had managed to change into comfortable jeans and a t-shirt. Boss, what if they don't give us any information? The girl looked into the lawyer's eyes. They will. He cut her off and walked towards the entrance gate. The two of them were allowed to pass through the entrance gate without any issues, and they reached the human resources department of the factory without incident. After a brief exchange of whispers with a middle-aged staff member, Garcia discreetly slid a bag of candies and champagne under her desk. I need some personal information. Alberto smiled, causing a dimple to appear under his right eye. Could you start by verifying if someone named Alonso Carlos worked here? Yes, he worked here. Unfortunately, he died in an accident. Garcia pulled out some photos from his folder. Please take a look. Is this him? I'm not sure. There's no photo in his personal file. She glanced at the monitor again. He worked in the fourth workshop. You can go there and ask the employees. They should know. Just wait until lunchtime. They won't let you into the workshop itself. Alberto and Olivia went downstairs and walked through the factory premises to the cafeteria. Let's wait here. Garcia took a seat at a plastic table. There should be a lot of people during lunch. He returned the photo to Olivia. By the way, you should participate too, so we can interview more workers. With enthusiasm, Olivia approached the men who had taken their seats and sat down next to them, asking questions. Alberto watched his assistant for a while, chuckled, and headed towards the nearest table. Excuse me, which workshop are you from? The unfriendly man cast a disdainful look at the lawyer from the corner of his eye, and Garcia clearly read the contempt in that glance. He recalled how these people had treated Olivia with smiles and felt a sense of indignation. We're not from the fourth workshop. The man finally answered reluctantly. What do you want? Well, I really need to talk to someone from the employees of the fourth workshop. Can you show me where I can find them? I'd be very grateful. Boss, Olivia practically sparkled with excitement. I've interviewed a few employees, but it might be better if you talk to them personally again. Let's sit here. She glanced at the unfriendly group of workers at the table. It might be better for you to talk to them. Hello, don't worry. We won't disturb you. Let's go find another table. Meanwhile, Olivia, acting like a kindergarten teacher, arranged everyone around the table and took a seat herself. Federico, Let's start with you. She playfully poked her fist into the shoulder of the young man she was leading by the hand. The young man immediately lowered his eyes and cleared his throat. Well, you probably already know that we're looking for a specific person. The lawyer scanned those present with his eyes. A certain Carlos Alonso was listed in your workshop. Well, he was listed, I guess, Federico replied hesitantly. He never showed up for work. I don't know what arrangement he had with the management, but others who needed extra shifts always worked in his place. So, you've never seen him? Garcia clarified with Federico. No. A man around 50 years old chimed in. He never showed up in the workshop at all. I only saw his last name on the attendance sheet. So showing you a photograph is useless, Alberto thought aloud. Federico, have you seen this man? Olivia placed the photograph on the table. Yeah. The guy nodded. I've definitely seen this guy a few times. He's kind of hard to forget. Olivia shot a triumphant glance at Garcia, who silently nodded, indicating that he appreciated the scale of her detective work. All right. Do you know his name? The lawyer asked Federico. No, I don't know. The guy scratched his nose. I didn't personally interact with him. I saw him always talking to someone from the management. Just to be sure, Garcia also showed the men a photo of the real Alonso. But as expected, no one had ever seen him. After bidding farewell to the workers, the lawyer and his assistant left the cafeteria. So, off to the management now? Olivia asked enthusiastically. No. What do you mean no? This fake Alonso was definitely involved in something shady with the factory's leadership. Garcia smirked. Well, how do you imagine that? He playfully ruffled Olivia's hair. Are we just going to storm into the director's office from the street and start making accusations? Is that the plan? Then what? Are we just heading back to the office? We'll have lunch first. After searching on his smartphone, Garcia found a nearby restaurant, ushered Olivia into the car, and took a seat himself. In the dimly lit small dining area, they placed their orders. I have a gut feeling that this stepfather of yours is involved in some dirty dealings. Garcia couldn't help but laugh. You really seem to enjoy playing detectives, cub, and the girl blushed slightly. Why shouldn't I enjoy it? It's exciting. And besides, I've always dreamed of working with you. Alberto raised an eyebrow. Am I that famous? Very much so. The waitress brought their order. Suddenly, Olivia felt ravenous and attacked the food. Well, okay, but still. Hold on. Chew first, then talk. Garcia interrupted her with a paternal tone. She quickly swallowed her bite. Well, you sound just like a grandpa. How old are you? Like 100, 130? Just 30. Alberto smiled. So what were you about to say? Huh? What are we going to do next? Garcia thoughtfully chewed on his steak. Well, I'll try to find someone who can help us get in touch with the management of the factory. Besides, I wanted to go to the city where the real Alonso is from. I'm coming with you. Olivia perked up in her chair. Don't object. I'm an excellent assistant. All right. Alberto reluctantly agreed. They spent the rest of the day peacefully in the office. Olivia dutifully sorted through papers, and Garcia made several phone calls. By evening, a satisfied smile had appeared on his face. Slipping on his coat, he stepped into the reception area. Time to go home. He called out to his assistant. Remember, tomorrow it's formal dress code. And please, no braids. You're not very good at it, okay? Olivia put on her windbreaker and headed towards the door. Will you give me a ride home? It's not far from here. Garcia was taken aback. Why on earth? He still had to give rides to his employees after work. Olivia looked back over her shoulder. Come on, why not? Let's go. I want to get home soon. Tomorrow we'll be investigating again, so I need to rest. Speechless from such rudeness, the lawyer quietly descended the stairs, following the girl. He clicked the key fob and, as if under a spell, opened the passenger door. Olivia got into the seat and fastened her seat belt. Give me your phone. I'll input the address into the navigation. Alberto silently handed his smartphone to Olivia. He himself wasn't entirely sure why he was going along with this girl's request. After 10 minutes, Garcia stopped in front of a charming multi-story new building. Well, boss, here we are. Good night. Olivia got out of the car and danced her way to the entrance. After watching her for a few seconds, Garcia shook his head as if shaking off a spell. He started the car. The next morning, the lawyer once again met his assistant at the office doors. Didn't they give you a key at the Shore department? Garcia opened the door and let Olivia in. They did. Olivia twirled in front of the mirror in the reception area. I just decided to wait for you. Is this business attire sufficient? Garcia glanced her over and shrugged. Acceptable. Oh my, boss. Have you ever communicated with women at all? How can you respond like that? All right. I'll grab something now, and then we'll head back to the factory. Ignoring Olivia, Garcia disappeared into his office. Throughout the journey, Olivia bombarded the lawyer with questions. Who are we going to see now? How do you know them? What are we going to ask? Alberto patiently answered. First, we'll go to the deputy director of the factory. I have an acquaintance who, as it turns out, knows this deputy director. So, I managed to arrange a meeting with him. We'll ask him about Alonso. At the entrance gate, their passes were ready. Once inside the administrative building, Olivia was amazed. Wow, what a palace! Have you seen the cafeteria? It must be like 300 years old. And these awful plastic tables must be at least 500. Of course, I've seen it. But plastic wasn't used 500 years ago. Garcia, for his part, was also unpleasantly surprised by the contrast between the director's office and the rest of the factory. What's happening in the workshops? Olivia couldn't calm down. The deputy director, named Rodriguez, turned out to be tall and robust. Among his shaggy, black-brown mane of hair and beard, his dark, slanted eyes sparkled. After shaking hands with Alberto and giving a nod to Olivia, the deputy director invited them into his luxurious office. Olivia settled on a huge couch made of pristine white leather and surreptitiously started observing the opulent surroundings. I wonder what the director's office is like, the girl thought. Walls adorned with gold, perhaps. Fernando? Alberto addressed the deputy. We wouldn't have bothered you, of course, but this matter is very delicate. If the details leak to the media, it won't be beneficial to anyone. Garcia cleared his throat meaningfully. Of course, Mr. Lawyer, I understand everything. The deputy nodded. But first, please tell me what this is about. Garcia crossed one leg over the other and opened a folder. The thing is, there was an employee named Carlos Alonso registered at your factory. Alberto pretended to search through the documents in the folder while discreetly glancing at the deputy. Rodriguez appeared imperturbed, but the hand resting on the armrest of his chair trembled slightly. Well, it's quite possible. Our enterprise is rather large. You understand? I can't remember all the employees personally, let alone the workers. It's sufficient for me to know that they conscientiously fulfill their duties. Monitoring employees is the responsibility of specific departments, not mine. Do you understand? Yes, of course. I didn't expect you to remember all your employees by face. That would be strange. Alberto shrugged and smiled. But let's try to figure out the situation together. Finally, the lawyer took a few papers out of the folder and slid them over to the deputy. Take a look, please. Maybe you'll recognize this person after all. His appearance is quite distinctive. Hard to forget. With the lower part of his face covered by his palm, Rodriguez looked at the photographs. I apologize, but I don't know him. Really? Garcia raised an eyebrow. But here's the thing. Carlos Alonso was listed as a lathe operator in the 4th workshop under your supervision. He was declared deceased in an accident. Rodriguez shrugged his shoulders. I understand, but as far as I know, the factory provided all the necessary compensations to the families of the victims and the injured. Garcia glanced at Olivia, who gave him a barely noticeable nod. It's not just about compensations, though they do play a part as well. What if I told you that one of the victims didn't actually die in the accident? Rodriguez frowned. What do you mean? The thing is, even though Alonso was listed as your employee, he never set foot in the workshop. That's the issue. It would be odd to assume that he suddenly decided to come to work for the first time on the day of the accident. It's possible, of course, but the odds are slim. The deputy director let out a heavy sigh. All right. I would like this conversation to remain between us. Yes, I did know Alonso. We once served together. He asked me for a favor, and I agreed. He needed an official job, so I arranged for him to be registered in our workshop on paper. It might not be entirely legal, but it didn't harm anyone either. Garcia quickly flipped through the documents. You served together, he clarified. Where exactly? In the Navy, Rodriguez answered reluctantly. Interesting story. According to my information, Alonso was granted an exemption from military service. He never served. So, what was your friend's name when you were in the Navy? The deputy's eyes darted around. I don't understand. Listen, you're risking getting involved in very unpleasant matters. Just answer, what's the name of the person in the photograph? Garcia pushed the photo closer to Rodriguez again. The deputy director awkwardly stroked his beard. I don't intend to meddle in his affairs, but, well, his name is Hugo Lopez. I have no idea why he changed his name. He said he was framed, dragged into debts. Since it didn't concern me, I had no intention of finding out the details. Do you understand? All right, let's summarize then. Then why was Alonso declared dead in the accident? Weren't you supposed to know for sure that he couldn't have been there? The deputy director turned pale. It was an expected question, but one he had hoped to avoid. Yes. He really got me into trouble, and he promised me that it wouldn't cost me anything. Rodriguez rubbed his forehead. When the accident happened, he asked me for one last favor. Do you know what he needed it for? Well, he said that his old creditors had found him again, and the last chance to escape persecution was to fake his own death. I see. I can't promise you that this conversation will stay between us. Garcia stood up from his seat. Go, Olivia, let's go. Exiting the factory, the lawyer turned to his assistant. Did you really receive compensation? Yes. The girl narrowed her eyes. But if I tell you the amount, you'll laugh. Besides, some recently appeared relatives demanded 3/4 of that sum for themselves. My mom, of course, didn't even argue. Garcia sighed. Marisol Alonso sometimes surprised him. It seemed that to build a fairly large business from scratch, one needed to have nerves of steel and an unwavering character. But when it came to anything unrelated to her business, Marisol was as pliable as clay. This woman simply attracted all sorts of scoundrels and swindlers. Olivia tugged on the lawyer's sleeve. Boss, we found out the real name of this person, okay. So, what are we going to do next? Well, what else? We'll dig into his past. Garcia absent-mindedly replied, lost in thought. After treating his assistant to lunch, Alberto Garcia drove her back to the office and left for the rest of the day. Olivia had to lock up the office by herself and head home. On the way, she pondered everything she had learned today. For some reason, the name Hugo Lopez seemed oddly familiar to her. She felt like she had heard it somewhere before. The next day, Garcia didn't show up for work until lunchtime. By then, Olivia had already started to miss him while answering phone calls and sorting through archived documents. Boss, she exclaimed joyfully. I thought you'd abandoned me. Where would I be without you? Alberto grumbled. Pack your things for a couple of days. We're going on a business trip tomorrow. Olivia's face lit up. Consider it done, boss. What should I bring? Well, decide for yourself. Garcia retreated into his office. The early twilight had not yet dispersed as Alberto pulled up to pick up his assistant. Olivia was already standing by the entrance, hopping on the spot to keep warm. I think I've frozen, Olivia said as she got into the car, immediately curling up and hugging herself for warmth. Alberto grabbed a blanket from the back seat and draped it over her. You can sleep for now. It's about a 3-hour drive ahead. Olivia snuggled comfortably under the blanket and gave a drowsy nod. Alberto stole a glance at her. In the uneven rays of the dawning sun, her profile looked particularly vulnerable. The lawyer shivered. How did he manage to get involved with this girl? Garcia decided not to wake Olivia when they entered the destination city. As they drove slowly through the sleepy streets, he marveled at the surroundings. Alberto was accustomed to his hometown, a green place with well-maintained historic mansions, parks, and alleys. Even the new buildings were small and neatly arranged, with cozy courtyards. But here, everything seemed gray. Instead of familiar trees, dull stumps protruded from the ground. The buildings mostly consisted of run-down 5-story panel buildings and new tall structures made of dark red bricks. What kind of city is this? Garcia thought in bewilderment. I feel like I'm in an apocalypse movie. As if to confirm his words, a stumbling figure suddenly emerged onto the road, clad in a shabby tracksuit. Alberto slammed on the brakes abruptly, trying to calm his racing heart. What's happened? Olivia asked groggily, awakened by the sudden jolt and gripping Alberto's hand. Have we arrived? Yes, Garcia replied grimly, his gaze fixed on the disheveled man. We're here. Well, Olivia exclaimed, staring out the window. This is so gloomy. I wouldn't want to live here. Don't want to? Then don't, Alberto absent-mindedly replied, entering an address into the GPS. For now, We're heading to the factory. Garcia wasn't surprised that the facility here appeared half abandoned and quite impressive. Dogs roamed the vast, cluttered territory, which terrified Olivia. Seeing a dog with bared teeth approaching, Olivia immediately clung to Garcia and hid behind him. Given the chance, she would likely have climbed on him like a monkey on a palm tree and stayed on his head until the factory visit was over. Alberto soothingly patted her hand and gave the dog a disapproving look. The dog promptly ticked its tail and retreated. Don't be afraid. Dogs sense fear. It's not like I can control it, Olivia grumbled, still clinging to Garcia. Boss, stay close, or I can't vouch for myself. Alberto chuckled and set off to find the HR department. No one was at the reception desk, so he had to search on his own. The organization of this place is in a terrible state, he remarked. Throughout their journey to the administrative building, they didn't encounter a single person. Rusty machinery and piles of tarpaulin were scattered everywhere on the premises. Are you sure this factory is still operating? I mean, this one? Olivia asked, eyeing a pack of dogs warily. Yes, sure. Garcia sighed. Does our factory canteen not seem so bad now, huh? Yeah, I guess we still have beauty and cleanliness. Olivia pointed upwards. And the weather here is so gloomy. It feels like something is about to happen. Upon reaching the building and studying the signs, the lawyer and his assistant finally found the HR department. Behind a worn desk that probably dated back to the 50s, sat a mustached man wearing round glasses. He was engrossed in studying the screen of an old computer, with a chubby gray cardboard folder and massive reports piled next to him. Wow, Olivia widened her eyes. This is a museum piece. Be quiet. The man at the desk flinched and adjusted his glasses. How can I help you? The HR officer's voice was surprisingly high-pitched, which amused Olivia greatly. She covered her mouth with her fist, suppressing her laughter. Garcia introduced himself and briefly explained that they were looking for Carlos Alonso. Carlos. The man seemed surprised. Well, he hasn't been working here for a while. Left without even submitting a resignation letter or returning his work records. Wow, do you remember all the factory workers? Olivia was amazed. Of course, I've been handling HR and accounting here for years. Well, maybe you could tell us something about him then. Garcia placed a package on the table. I brought pastries, tea, coffee. The man quickly remembered the worn sign on the door. Jorge, let's have some tea. The man's enthusiasm was palpable. Well, why not? I'm always ready. I'll call Isabel as well. You don't mind, do you? She might have some information too. The man quickly dialed a phone number. I always knew that Carlos didn't just disappear for no reason, even though his mother insisted he was fine. The man continued. Garcia became cautious, but he didn't show it. He needed to find out everything first. After 5 minutes, the kettle was boiling, and a plump woman with gray hair and 2 braids entered the office. Isabel, these young people are looking for Carlos Alonso. After all these years, the woman exclaimed, raising her hands. Opening the box of pastries, Isabel brightened up slightly. Well, at least someone cared. He was such a good boy. The woman didn't need much convincing. She gladly started telling them everything she knew about Alonso. Isabel was closely related to Carlos' family since she was a distant relative on his father's side. Paula, Carlos' mother, married Pablo not out of any great love. the woman recounted. No, Pablo adored Paula, but she was just healing the wounds of a failed romance. Quickly realizing that a marriage to Pablo Alonso would be advantageous for her, Paula accepted his ardent courtship, and the two soon got married. From the very first day, it was clear that the plan had failed. Paula didn't just not love her husband. She found him terribly annoying in everything he did. How he dressed, how he walked, how he ate, how he breathed. Meanwhile, Pablo tried to please his wife, attempting to fix his shortcomings. However, a year after their wedding, Paula gave birth to Carlos. Pablo couldn't get enough of his son from his beloved wife. He threw himself into providing for the family with double enthusiasm. Paula, on the other hand, didn't love her husband and felt no affection for her son either. Gladly pushing the child off onto her mother-in-law, she lived her own separate life, detached from the family. No matter how much Pablo tried, he couldn't get the slightest bit of affection from his wife. He worked here at the factory, Isabel said, devastated. And not just as anyone, but as a manager. But when tough times came, the factory was quickly plundered, and what remains now is probably only a tenth of what it used to be. Left without a job, Pablo naturally became unnecessary to his wife. One fine day, Paula packed her bags and disappeared. By that time, Carlos was already a teenager, and he understood something about his parents' relationship. He reacted calmly to his mother's departure, but his father fell into depression. At that time, the only one helping them was Pablo's mother, Carlos' grandmother. She bore the weight of both her desperate son and teenage grandson. Time heals, so after 6 months, Pablo seemed to start coming back to life. He found steady work in one of the many new companies and began earning money. His mother sighed in relief. But trouble always comes unexpectedly. One day, on his way home from work, Pablo stopped by a store and, on his way out, bumped into a well-dressed Paula. His former wife was arm in arm with a typical man. Sliding an indifferent glance over Pablo, she turned away, hanging on her companion. From that day on, Pablo fell into despair again, and this time it was final. Carlos knew that his father had seen his mother with someone else. He supported his dad as best as he could, but Alonso's heart was completely shattered. "I don't want to judge anyone," sighed Isabel. Pablo acted poorly. He was just a young man. Besides, he had a son to take care of. On a cold October night, Pablo left home and disappeared. His body was found a week later. According to the investigation, he had been drinking and accidentally fell into a river, where he drowned. Everyone understood that he did it himself intentionally. The janitor concluded. He simply didn't want to live and fight anymore. Carlos and his grandmother struggled. The boy was still in school. His grandmother had a pension and a small side job. The woman worked as a janitor in her own yard. They didn't have enough money. The grandmother tried to contact Paula, but she didn't want to communicate with her former mother-in-law. Her son's fate didn't interest her. When Carlos turned 15, his mother suddenly showed up at their doorstep in the middle of the night. Paula's face was bruised. There were marks of ropes on her wrists, and she was wearing only a thin nightgown and slippers. "I don't know what happened to you," said the mother-in-law, letting her former daughter-in-law into the house. "But you have no conscience, Paula." For the first week, Paula only silently shed tears and flitted from the room to the bathroom like a shadow. But soon, her usual arrogance and quarrelsome nature returned. She shamelessly insulted her mother-in-law. You know, dear, don't confuse me with my late son. He accommodated himself to you his whole life. And where did that lead? It won't work with me. Change your tone or leave my house." Paula, with nowhere else to go, submitted for the time being. But as if fate favored her, shortly after, her arrogance returned. Half a year later, the mother-in-law died suddenly, and the only heir to her apartment was Carlos. However, the boy hadn't reached adulthood, and Paula remained his legal representative. Paula, who had fully tasted the sweet life with the new man, decided to act contrary to expectations. She didn't enter into a relationship with yet another businessman, but instead began an affair with a completely ordinary worker from an auto repair shop. This Lorenzo, oh my! Isabel raised her eyebrows. He moved into the apartment that, mind you, belonged to Carlos, and he started terrorizing Carlos. Carlos endured all the insults from his mother, the humiliations from Lorenzo, the lack of proper clothes and food. His mother and stepfather shamelessly spent his late father's pension without any remorse. Carlos, on the other hand, received things only based on what was left over. The worse off he was, the better. But the problem lay in the fact that after his father and grandmother's deaths, a painful dependency on his mother began to develop in the teenager. He felt that if she wasn't around, he would be completely alone in this world. He was willing to do whatever they told him, just to avoid being alone. Paula and Lorenzo didn't tie the knot, but soon Paula found herself in an interesting condition. And after 9 months, little Luca came into the world. She loved Luca so much. She immersed herself in motherhood. Carlos' life became unbearable. If before he could at least create the illusion of a normal family, now he was completely pushed to the farthest and dustiest corner. Paula generously allocated a small room to her eldest son to use as his living space. His room was turned into a nursery where the younger brother ruled. Paula and Lorenzo occupied the former grandmother's bedroom. There was also a living room, but Paula considered giving her son a whole room too extravagant. Carlos finished school and went to a nearby town to study in college. At that point, he didn't care where he went, as long as he was far away from the unbearable hatred that surrounded his so-called family. He couldn't be an obedient servant to his mother, stepfather, and younger brother any longer. Settling into a dormitory, the young man finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had a proper bed, not limited by the narrowness of a small lodge, his own desk and wardrobe, and for the first time, real friends appeared. The time spent studying became the best part of his bleak life. After finishing college, Carlos returned to his hometown with a determination to assert his rights. He hadn't communicated with his mother during his years of education, and she hadn't sought out contact with him either. Therefore, Carlos' return was unexpected for Paula. The young man silently entered the familiar apartment and dropped his bag on the floor. "What does this mean?" Paula asked with suspicion. "I've come home," her son replied calmly. Over the years, he had grown and matured. He was no longer the beaten, skinny teenager. Before Paula stood a handsome, fair-haired young man, with bright eyes in which a hidden pain still lingered. The woman gloomily surveyed her eldest son. Changes had occurred in her life as well. Lorenzo had left for someone else, leaving her alone with a small child. In a way, it's not so bad that he's come back, Paula thought. At least he learned money. "I'll take one of the rooms," Carlos calmly said and walked into the kitchen. "You can choose which one for yourself." Paula settled her eldest son in the living room. He redecorated it according to his own taste, bought new furniture, and began living a peaceful life. He easily found a job at the factory and earned a decent salary. Despite the dire state of the enterprise, there was one significant advantage. Almost all the workers knew each other and treated each other like family, ready to support each other in difficult situations. Carlos suddenly felt the warmth and care he had been missing. They loved him at work, Isabel said with a smile. He was such a good, calm guy. And then he met Raquel. Raquel worked as a kindergarten teacher. Carlos was introduced to her by one of his friends, and the young people quickly developed a close relationship. Unfortunately, Carlos was repeating his father's unhappy fate. Raquel didn't love him at all. She was 5 years older than Carlos and didn't possess any remarkable looks. But Carlos, who longed to create his own family, seemed blinded by love. He idolized Raquel, oblivious to her cold looks and contempt. Soon, the young couple got married. Carlos silently brought his wife home. He lived in the largest room, so they comfortably settled there together. Paula was furious that her disliked son dared to bring a stranger into the apartment. Very quickly, she started to engage in subversive activities, doing her best to play the role of an evil mother-in-law. Raquel was just as venomous as Paula. Conflict took firm root in the apartment, and Carlos did his best to manage it. Although he managed to establish his place in the house, he still remained too gentle. Carlos couldn't kick his mother and younger brother out onto the street. So, he endured constant scandals and fights. On one hand, his wife berated him, demanding that he resolve the housing issue. "I don't want to live with your crazy mother and spoiled little brother. Decide something already. Who are they anyway? Let them leave," Raquel shouted. "Rent an apartment. Buy a house. Do whatever you want. I don't want to live under the same roof as that witch," his mother screamed. Meanwhile, Raquel gave birth to 2 daughters, and the atmosphere in the apartment became increasingly tense. Carlos worked very hard. He set a goal for himself: to buy an apartment for his mother and brother. He was determined to separate his family, no matter the cost. Finally, Alonso fulfilled his dream. He managed to save enough money to live separately from his mother. Paula stood her ground. She wasn't going to live in a cramped one-room apartment with her grown-up younger son. Carlos got into debt, acquired a 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. Finally, the family could breathe a sigh of relief. However, over the years of living in an atmosphere of Cold War with his mother-in-law, Raquel didn't develop any love for her husband. In fact, she accumulated numerous grievances against Carlos. First and foremost, what infuriated her was that her husband had bought an apartment for the detested Paula. The property was registered under Carlos's name. But still, years passed, and Raquel's hatred for Carlos only grew stronger. Both daughters imitated their mother's attitude towards their father. Contempt for the forever exhausted, work-worn Alonso was evident in the girls' faces. He increasingly started disappearing on weekends, going out into nature with friends or helping them repair cars. He didn't care what he did, as long as he didn't have to be alone with a family from which he never gained any love. And then, Raquel filed for divorce. Both daughters were already attending college at the time. They received the news of their parents' separation with absolute indifference. Carlos also took the news of the divorce very calmly. It seemed like something had died within him. He was probably tired of fighting for happiness and just wanted to live without relying on his family. Of course, Raquel began dividing their shared property. Carlos indifferently told his mother that they would have to sell the apartment. He would give Raquel half the sum and use the remaining amount to buy another property. Oh, what a commotion there was. Paula often came to the factory, dragging her grown-up boyfriend with her. Luca was already over 20, and it was as if they were being kicked out onto the street with a child. But this time, Carlos Alonso seemed entirely unaffected. He looked on indifferently as his mother threw tantrums and shrugged his shoulders. "You knew it wasn't your apartment. You should have saved for your own." In the end, the proceeds from the sale of the 2-bedroom apartment were not enough even for a 1-bedroom apartment. Carlos bought a tiny studio in a new building and handed the keys to his mother. "If you want, live there yourself. If you want, rent it out and find something else. I don't care." Paula, after causing yet another scandal, eventually took the keys and disappeared. To be honest, not long before his disappearance, Carlos seemed to have brightened up somehow. He became more sociable. His eyes lit up. We thought maybe he had met a woman. But then he just didn't show up for work. And the factory workers got worried. One of the most hard-working employees suddenly stopped showing up for shifts. His phone was unanswered, and there was no resignation letter from him. Several workers from the same department went to Carlos's home, but no one answered the door. Then Isabel used her connections and got in touch with Paula. Carlos's mother calmly stated that there was nothing to worry about. Her eldest son had simply moved to another city. "How is there nothing to worry about?" the HR manager fumed. "Why didn't he resign properly? Why didn't he come?" Probably, he didn't want to work the mandatory 2-week notice. Paula shrugged with a cold smile. "You are all so intrusive here. Carlos told me that you would pester him with questions, so he decided to avoid them." The close friends and acquaintances of Carlos Alonso had no idea where he had gone. He seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth in an instant. "And then we found out that his apartment had been sold," Alberto said, taking out his folder of documents again and showing a photograph. "Is this him, Carlos Alonso?" The HR manager adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Yes, that's him. This is Carlos. He looks so handsome here." Isabel teared up, and Garcia pulled out another photo. "Have you ever seen this person by any chance?" The HR manager frowned. "I've seen him. I think I've seen him. It's Hugo," Isabella exclaimed. Garcia raised an eyebrow. "You know him?" "Not like I know him directly, but..." Isabel hesitated. "But he's definitely a friend of Carlos. He came to the factory a few times. I remember. He's a strange man. Unique. And then I saw him in town. But this time he was with Paula." "What? With Alonso's mother?" Olivia exclaimed. "What could they possibly have in common?" "I have no idea." Isabel frowned. "But it was definitely them. They were sitting in a cafe." "Was this before or after Alonso's disappearance?" Olivia asked. "Definitely before. I even thought back then that this Hugo was some sort of family friend, since both Paula and Carlos knew him." Thanking the janitor and the HR manager, Garcia and Olivia left the factory. "I'm so confused," Olivia complained. "Boss, what does all this mean?" Hugo recognized Alonso, and both of them disappeared within a 5-year gap. "I don't understand anything." "It's time to talk to Paul," the lawyer smiled. "Although I think it won't be easy. Let's grab a bite, and then we'll work out our plan of action." "I want macaroni," Olivia declared. "What?" "I can smell macaroni from the cafeteria." She swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and Garcia rubbed his chin. "Well, I don't know where I'll find that for you." "All right, let's go." After wandering through the gloomy town, The lawyer parked the car near a small cafe. "Well, it looks decent enough," he said hesitantly. But Olivia, not paying attention to him, had already rushed inside. "Do you have chicken pasta?" she asked the waitress from the doorway. "We do." The waitress smiled politely and seated the pair at a table. Garcia placed an order and looked around. "It's so clean in here." For some reason, this town gave me the impression of something quite dirty. "Yeah, I felt the same way," Olivia replied, taking a piece of bread from the basket and starting to chew. "Yeah, the story of this Alonso, it's suffocating, sticky, unpleasant. Why did so much foreign hatred fall on a decent person like him? His mother is just terrifying, and his wife, and his daughters." "Well, these things happen," Garcia calmly responded. "Let's just find out what really happened first, and then we can draw conclusions." The waitress brought their plates. Olivia immediately started eating the pasta and closed her eyes in pleasure. "I've noticed you have quite the appetite." Alberto twirled his fork in the air. "Are you still growing?" "Well, I'm 23 after all," the girl mumbled with her mouth full. "Just a good metabolism." "All right." Garcia didn't argue. "And don't talk until you finish chewing. Don't want you to choke." "You sound like a grandpa again." "No, I just don't want your mom to never forgive me if something happens to you." After chatting about various topics, they finished their lunch and left the cafe. The weather had cleared slightly outside, but the town still looked gloomy. "There's so little greenery here. I wonder why. Usually, in the countryside, everything is drowning in trees, like where we live. But here it's even hard to breathe," Olivia remarked. "Maybe that's why all these strange stories happen here." Garcia smiled. A suspicious town, unusual people. They got into the car. "Let's go to Paula's house. If she's not there, we'll wait," the lawyer explained and started the engine. Paula, according to the information Garcia had, was still living in that very studio apartment purchased by Alonso. By the way, if the apartment is in his name, how could the fake Alonso not include it in the marriage contract? Olivia suddenly perked up. "Well, most likely, it already belongs to Paula," Alberto enigmatically explained. They pulled up to a tall, elongated building with multiple entrances. "Oh, how awful," Olivia shivered. "It's like an anthill." "Yeah, I don't really understand why they would build such buildings in a small town. It's not a metropolis. Probably cheaper that way." The lawyer and his assistant double-checked the address and approached one of the many entrances. Garcia dialed the apartment number on the intercom. After a while, a flirtatious female voice was heard. "Who are you looking for?" "Paula." Garcia pronounced the name with a tender tone that sent shivers down Olivia's spine. "Is he trying to charm her?" "Yes, it's me. Can I come up? I have a few questions about the inheritance of your late son. It's about an insurance payout that no relatives have claimed yet." After that sentence, the front door swung open. Olivia and Alberto exchanged glances. "Looks like this lady is eager to snatch any scrap of profit from her son's death. Or Hugo's supposed death. I mean not death. Well, you get it." Olivia tangled herself up in her own conclusions and fell silent. The studio was on the 8th floor. After walking down a long corridor with numerous doors, Garcia and Olivia arrived at the correct apartment. The door was opened by a woman in a rather revealing, casual outfit. Olivia shot her an unimpressed glance. Paula clearly considered herself attractive, which was, in truth, accurate. The woman had a slim figure and long legs. a pretty face framed by thick, dark chestnut hair cut in a bob. It wasn't surprising that Pablo had loved his emotionally distant wife so much. "Come in." Paula cast a sharp glance at Olivia. The apartment smelled of coffee and sweet perfume. Paula walked over to the stove and turned off the kettle. She silently poured the drink into tiny cups and invited the visitors to sit at the bar counter. "So, what about the insurance payout?" Paula inquired and took a sip of her drink. "Paula, could you please answer me? Where is your elder son?" Garcia asked calmly. The woman's hand trembled slightly, and a few drops of the drink splattered onto the white countertop. "What do you mean?" "My son died in an accident at the plant." Paula raised an eyebrow. Garcia placed a photograph in front of her. "Did this son die at the plant?" Paula blinked several times. It was a genuine picture of Carlos Alonso. Of course, she couldn't fail to recognize him. She continued to remain silent, clearly weighing her options. During the inheritance dispute scandal, she had already seen photographs of a completely different person and had said nothing. Did her interlocutor know about that? "Paula, just answer the question." Garcia smiled. "Is this your son?" He pulled out another photograph, showing Hugo Lopez. "Or is this your son?" The woman took another sip from her cup and stared intently at the lawyer. "And who are you? And why should I answer you?" she asked. "Well, because it's in your best interest to answer me right now, rather than the police. Isn't it? For now, my task is simply to find answers to questions. But if you, Paula, insist otherwise, then the conversation will continue in the investigator's office. You understand that yourself, don't you?" "Then send me a summons," Paula snorted. Garcia stood up and motioned for Olivia to follow him. "Well, thank you for the tea. We'll see each other again." The woman's complexion paled. She could sense the impending danger. "All right, I'll answer your questions. I don't want to deal with the police." Garcia once again took a seat on the high bar stool and smiled. "Well, then, let's start from the beginning. Paula, where did Carlos Alonso disappear to 5 years ago?" "He went to work." Paula waved her hand in the air. "I don't know where. I wasn't interested. His friend arranged it." "This friend?" The lawyer pointed to Hugo's photo. Paula looked at Hugo's face again and nodded. "Yes, that one." "Did you know that after Carlos disappeared, Hugo Lopez assumed his documents and identity?" "How could I know that?" Paula retorted. "I never had a close relationship with my elder son. He left and never contacted me again. Later, I learned that my son had died, and that was the end of it." "Why are you being deceptive, Paula?" Garcia toyed with the teacup in his hands. "Even if initially you believed that your son had died, you saw the photographs that Marisol brought, and you didn't have any questions." "Yes, I didn't pay attention," the woman curtly replied. "Why should I? I'm entitled to the inheritance. The rest doesn't concern me." "You say they were close with your son?" "Yes, that's correct." "So, who owns this apartment?" At this point, Paula seemed a bit flustered. "It's mine." "Why?" "Carlos bought it in his name." "When did he manage to transfer it to you?" The woman snorted in response. "He knew he was leaving for a long time. That's why he sold his apartment and transferred this one." "I don't understand why this interests you so much." "Paula, I'll be frank. I'm convinced that you, together with Hugo Lopez, did something to Carlos Alonso, and I will find out exactly what. The degree of responsibility you will bear for what happened depends on you." If I can find Lopez, he will be held accountable for his actions as well. Understand? Just that he's unlikely to protect you. Paula visibly shuddered. She was well aware of what kind of person Hugo was. Counting on him to cover for her was certainly not an option. Well, fine. The woman paused. I'll tell you what I know. After the divorce of her elder son, Carlos, Paula had been furious. Not only did she have to move into this small studio, but her ungrateful elder son also flatly refused to transfer the apartment to her name. If you had just transferred that apartment to me from the start, I wouldn't have to share it now with your greedy ex, Paula had shouted at her son. But he only shrugged indifferently. Paula realized that she had lost any influence over her son and suppressed her anger. Her younger son, Luca, had already left to study. At least she didn't have to share this studio with anyone else. Paula had always been an attractive woman and attracted the attention of men. Often on weekends, she would go to quiet bars with a couple of her friends. One evening, Paula met Hugo there. It didn't bother her much that he was almost the same age as her elder son. After all, she didn't look her age. Hugo charmed Paula. They even dated for a while. But one evening, Hugo Lopez initiated a strange conversation. Paula, you are quite charming. Lopez sweetly smiled at his companion. But I have certain habits, and you're lucky that you don't fit my preferences. I don't fit? What do you mean? Paula was taken aback. You see, I don't date women who aren't well off. Hugo continued. You look well groomed. You wear expensive clothes, shoes, and the place where we met isn't cheap either. Paula felt her jaw drop in astonishment. This jerk was trying to say that he only got involved with her because of her expensive belongings. Hugo stroked Paula's hand. Well, don't be upset. I do find you attractive. I'm glad we can part as good friends. Friends? Paula pursed her lips. Dream on. Listen to me to the end, please. Suddenly, Lopez tightened his grip on Paula's hand, his face becoming stern. You'll like what I have to say. Speak. Paula, now pale, tried to subtly extract her hand from Hugo Lopez's iron grip. Of course, I was disappointed when I learned that among all your possessions, you only have this pathetic room. But then, I saw your passion. You practically radiate resentment whenever your elder son is mentioned. Hugo smiled. He must have offended you somehow, right? Tell me everything. I'll help you seek justice. Unexpectedly, even to herself, Paula spilled her story to Lopez. Hearing this confession, any normal person would have formed a negative impression of Paula. A mother who abandoned her husband and son, now demanding material goods from them. But Hugo listened attentively, nodding and smiling in response. I have a proposal for you, my dear. I'll make sure your son goes far away for a long time. I'll find him a good job. In return, I'll need his documents and your silence. We'll sell his apartment and split the money. Trust me, he won't object. And we'll put your room in your name. Are you in? At this point, Olivia couldn't hold back. Listen, this all sounds terrible. Please don't tell me you believed him. What do you mean? He won't object. The woman smirked in response. Well, the woman said with emphasis, I believe it. Why shouldn't I believe it? And who can prove otherwise? It's useless to argue with her, Olivia thought, gritting her teeth. Garcia, trying to soothe the assistant, patted her hand and gave her a meaningful look. Olivia caught the message not to interfere and fell silent. Paula provided all the information she had about her son and waited. The charming Hugo quickly bonded with Alonso. He managed to engage him in a new hobby, hunting. He went on 2-day trips with Carlos several times. Alonso became livelier. He began to trust his new friend, and even friends and colleagues noticed positive changes in Carlos's behavior. And then Hugo came with the power of attorney. We sold one apartment, re-registered another, divided the money. Paul looked up at the ceiling. That's it. And Carlos, what happened to your son? Garcia tried to catch the evasive gaze of the woman. Paula smiled widely. I told you, he went to work. I don't know the details. Ask Hugo. Garcia stood up abruptly and headed towards the exit, dragging Olivia behind him. He silently put on his shoes and left the apartment. Boss, why are you so angry? She squeaked as they both got into the car. Just that I've seen a lot. But this woman, she sold her own son and doesn't even repent for it. Garcia wearily covered his eyes with his palm. He felt a betraying sting in his nose. The lawyer suddenly remembered his parents, who had been gone for 10 years already. His parents had died in a car accident. They were kind, sensitive, understanding people. They loved children, poured their hearts into their children, and never got to see their grandchildren or lead a peaceful life. And here was Paula, who had tormented her son all her life and then handed him over to another predator, continuing to live. Why is everything so unfair? I will definitely find that scoundrel Lopez. Garcia hissed through his teeth, and they both will answer for it. Olivia nodded quietly. Alberto's expression frightened her, but she decided to keep silent. The man was clearly preoccupied with something painful. Garcia dropped Olivia off at the hotel and told her to wait. You'll have dinner at the cafe downstairs. I'll be late. Olivia couldn't let go of this entire story. Lopez pretending to be Alonso and marrying her mother was unfathomable. He had been around for 5 years, and she knew nothing. With fear, she realized that her mom had lived under the same roof with a heartless criminal for 5 years. What could have scared him off? Olivia thought. There must be a reason he orchestrated this whole circus with his own death. Olivia sat down on the bed and fidgeted with her phone in her hands. She felt the urge to call her mother and warn her, in case he appeared again. Something like what he had done to the real Carlos Alonso. She frightened herself so much that her body began to tremble slightly. Olivia wrapped herself in a blanket and sat on the windowsill, gazing downward. Garcia still hadn't returned. Where did you go? Come back soon, she repeated. Finally, the sound of an engine reached her ears, and the familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Olivia jumped in place, tossed the blanket to the floor, and hurried downstairs. Meanwhile, Garcia, unsuspecting, twirled a candy in his hands, staring at the night sky. Throughout the day, he had learned a lot. Perhaps, in all his practice, he had never encountered a case like this. Why would I get involved in something like this? He thought. I'm a divorce attorney, not a criminal lawyer. Yet, it was exhilarating. Over the past few days, he had carefully unraveled the sticky web of someone else's lies and betrayal. Suddenly, someone collided with him, hitting him in the stomach and wrapping their arms around him. Garcia grunted, and slightly bending, found himself face to face with Olivia. The girl was incredibly pale and bewildered. Boss, I'm so scared. What if this Lopez shows up at my mom's and does something to her? Let's call her and warn her. I wanted to do it myself. She shoved her phone in Garcia's face. But then I thought, what if we shouldn't? What if it jeopardizes the case? Alberto let out a sigh of exasperation. What were you thinking while I was gone? He tousled her hair and tried to pull away. But Olivia continued to hold on to him tightly, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. Garcia blushed ever so slightly. Why are you clinging to me like that? Are you really scared? Olivia nodded several times, her movements small. Don't worry, the attorney sighed. I know where Lopez is right now. He's not in our city. We'll pay him a visit tomorrow. Really? She suddenly realized that she had been pressed up against her boss for several minutes, and he, in turn, was frozen like a log. Ho, boss. Olivia stepped back. I'm sorry. I was just really scared for my mom. Did I hurt you? And the girl shook off the lawyer's sleeves a few times. Well, I'm not made of porcelain, Garcia grumbled. How could you have hurt me? Let's go to sleep. You are already at an age? Olivia glanced sideways at her boss. Your bones must be fragile. I'm only 7 years older than you, Garcia protested. Is that so? Olivia squinted. Yay, not a big difference. Well, that's good. And the girl disappeared through the hotel door. Alberto, bewildered, watched her go. What was that just now? Was she flirting with him? After a sleepless night, a grumpy Garcia met his assistant in the lobby. Boss, why are you so grumpy? Olivia somehow managed to find a pastry. Do you want to eat? I don't eat in the mornings. Garcia looked around and frowned at the girl. It was because of her that he couldn't sleep. What the hell made her hug him? And then she was smiling strangely and saying all sorts of things. Alberto hadn't been in a relationship for a while. His last romance had caused him a lot of pain. Never again. He had decided for himself. And now this Olivia had unexpectedly stirred his heart. Stay here. Garcia turned to Olivia. It might be dangerous there. Where there? She asked. Where I'm going. You can walk around the city or watch a movie in your room. I don't know. Just stay here. I'm definitely going. Don't even start, boss. Garcia tapped his foot and turned away. Everything was irritating him right now. In the hotel lobby, a fit man appeared. Hello, Alberto. You look good. Actually, it's against the rules to take you along. Don't make things up, comrade investigator. Garcia laughed. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have a case. Are you so sure? The stranger squinted. If anything, we've been investigating this group for a while now. An oblivious Olivia shifted her gaze from one man to the other. Let's get in the car. Garcia addressed his assistant. I'll clarify something for you on the way. And I'll ride with you. Otherwise, it's cramped with the guys there, the stranger said. Olivia, this is Luis. He's a special investigator. Alberto introduced the man. And the girl nodded shyly. Seated in the car, the men exchanged a few words and started a tedious conversation about former colleagues. Boss, Olivia protested, who had been patiently waiting for about 10 minutes for them to tell her something. Comrade investigator, well, who will start? Garcia asked with a smile. Let's start with you, and I'll add on. Okay. You see, Olivia, Alberto began the story. You're still young, and there's much you don't know. Come on. The girl playfully punched her boss's shoulder. Let's skip that, okay? All right. Garcia chuckled slightly. It just so happened that Hugo Lopez was not born into the right family. He was handsome, bright, extraordinary, and intelligent. He would have been fit for an old English aristocratic lineage, or in a family of hereditary intellectuals, scholars, Even better, in an acting dynasty, Hugo considered himself exceptionally talented and versatile. Well, partly that was true. Of course, the boy possessed a charismatic appearance, an unmatched sense of style, and an absolute musical ear. But here's the trouble. He was born to utterly ordinary parents. You couldn't get any more ordinary. His mother was a kook, his father a driver. No one had a higher education. They were all accustomed to working hard. But such an existence was utterly unsuitable for Hugo. He wanted not just more, but something entirely different. From a young age, Hugo was popular with girls. After finishing school, he served in the army. Then, without hesitation, he left his hometown and went to the capital. There, a young, attractive guy decided not to burden himself with heavy work. Hugo quickly found a well-off middle-aged woman who was ready to support a handsome guy. True, this didn't last long, Alberto narrated. When that very woman caught Lopez cheating, and with a young student no less, without a second thought, she kicked the clumsy gigolo out. Hugo then had to rethink things. The idea was good, but too complicated to execute. Lopez had no intention of confining himself or staying faithful. So, he found his first wife, who wasn't rich or even moderately well off. He quickly charmed the young girl, married her, and began searching for his place in life. Lopez's first wife worked and supported the family, while Hugo developed plans for his own business. "Anna, I need money to develop my own business," Lopez stated, presenting his project. The young wife was perplexed. After all, she didn't have any substantial savings. Where would they come from? That's when Hugo came up with a brilliant idea. "We should sell the 3-bedroom apartment, buy a 1-bedroom, and invest the remainder in the business. Then, when the business takes off, we'll get an even better apartment," Lopez assured his wife. "But only when I get the business going." "But how will I commute to work from another city?" the woman asked, confused. "By train?" Lopez calmly replied. "And I'll take the train too. What's the big deal?" Hugo's wife was very young, and there was no one around to guide her on what to do. Only her husband and his grand dreams. In the end, they sold the apartment, bought a smaller one, and invested the remaining money in the business. At least, that's how Hugo explained it to his wife. 6 months later, Anna started to suspect something. She commuted to work 5 days a week, 2 hours each way, while Hugo enjoyed sleeping in until noon and then engaged in who knows what. As soon as the young wife expressed her concern, Hugo got offended immediately. "Look at you. Yes, they say women truly can't be with someone both in sorrow and in joy. Yes, my first attempt at starting a business failed. So what? But hardly anyone succeeds on the first try. And you, instead of supporting me." Lopez was terribly upset and filed for divorce. Anna was bewildered. She tried to figure out where the money from the apartment sale went. Where did it go? Lopez widened his eyes. "I invested it in the business, but it went under." "But who will give me back the apartment?" the young woman cried. Hugo gently stroked her head. "Don't cry. You still have an apartment. Don't worry. I won't claim a share of the property, even though you understand that it's marital property." Left with a tidy sum after the divorce, Lopez went into a frenzy. Of course, he never invested the money into any business. Why would he, when he could continue living his life of pleasure? After the naive and foolish Anna, he had a few more wives. After divorcing Lopez, he managed to charm the young heiress of a very wealthy businessman. The father, of course, wasn't thrilled about his daughter's choice. However, Hugo was confident that everything would go smoothly. He once again initiated a conversation about his own business, which was met with a quite substantial response from his father-in-law. Lopez, at that point, was already well into his 40s, while his young wife, despite her age, turned out to be not so simple. Hugo spent a long time trying to find his wife's weak spot and eventually took advantage of a major, somewhat illegal deal involving his father-in-law and stole the money. This became dangerous. He had the means, but he couldn't openly spend them. Hugo realized that his former father-in-law wouldn't leave him alone that easily. He needed protection. He needed protection. In short, that's how this fool got involved with the local criminals. Garcia summarized. He told his new friends that he needed to change his identity. Nothing could be simpler. One of his acquaintances smirked. Find someone and bring them to us. They'll willingly give you their name. What? Olivia gasped. So he just handed over an innocent person to some thugs? Garcia let out a bitter smile. Yes, that's exactly what he did. Moreover, with the help of that innocent person's own mother. And that's what's most frightening. What happened to him? Olivia bit her lip. What did they do to Alonso? Well, we'll find that out soon, I hope, the investigator replied. As they drove, Olivia couldn't calm down. Okay, fine. He got new documents. But why did he marry my mom? Why stage his own death? I have a hunch about why, but it's better to ask him directly. Alberto gently responded. Fine. Olivia grumbled and stared at the passing forest outside the window. They drove along rural roads for quite a while, some of which were barely visible. Finally, the car stopped amidst the trees. Not far away, a brick fence with barbed wire on top came into view. A few minutes later, near the fence, a group of Special Forces personnel appeared, moving silently and swiftly. Olivia observed the ensuing actions as though she were in a movie theater, watching a large screen. In a matter of moments, the operatives scaled the fence. There was silence for a while, but then the sounds of struggle and even a few gunshots could be heard. Olivia clenched into a ball. I told you to stay at the hotel, didn't I? Garcia demanded insistently. You did. I'm very glad I didn't listen to you, and I don't plan to blindly follow your advice in the future. Olivia continued staring at the fence, leaving Garcia speechless. Finally, the massive gate swung open, and several police vans and ambulances approached. Olivia watched intently as the operatives escorted people out, some of them already in handcuffs, loading them into the vans. Among these people, Olivia suddenly noticed a familiar face. That's him, she exclaimed, pointing her finger. Lopez. Indeed, Garcia smiled. I had a feeling he would be hiding here. The lawyer anxiously scanned another group of people. Emaciated, pale men in simple, worn-out clothes were emerging from the gates, looking around in bewilderment as if they hadn't seen open space in a long time. Alonso, Alberto whispered suddenly. Thank God. Where? Olivia turned her head frantically. There. But he looks like an old man. Alberto sighed. Yes. After being held in captivity for 5 years, a person can change somewhat. What captivity? Olivia didn't understand. We're in the 21st century. How could there be captivity? Oh my God. Olivia, you're a lawyer, and yet so naive. You still have a lot to learn. Teach me then. I'm not opposed. Olivia grumbled and turned away. They headed back in heavy silence. The investigator was busy with his tablet, making notes from time to time, while Olivia and Garcia were lost in their own thoughts. Alberto engaged in a lengthy conversation with the investigator, while Olivia gathered her belongings, preparing for the journey home. "Will you wait until we get back to tell my mom everything? Or will you tell me on the way?" Olivia asked, settling into the car. "Yes, I'll tell you," Garcia replied. Having made a deal with the local criminals, Lopez became completely entangled. He didn't want to know what would happen to the person he delivered to the criminals. A chance encounter with Paula sealed his fate. The prey practically fell into his lap. Hugo befriended Alonso, deliberately went hunting a couple of times with his new friend, and then took him directly to the base, where he was ordered to deliver the victim. Hugo Lopez had no doubts that he was doing the right thing. His life was in danger, so why should he care about others? Damn, he just had to meet Paula of all people. And why is everyone treating Alonso like this? Olivia exclaimed, hitting the dashboard with her fist. Garcia nodded, agreeing with the young woman. Alonso's fate had been sealed. Lopez led his friend behind the brick fence and left him there, walking away with someone else's documents in his pocket. This meant he could start a new life. Out of habit, Hugo found himself a wealthy woman. He chose Marisol, who lived up to his expectations, and immediately fell in love with the passionate suitor. But then that inconvenient prenuptial agreement appeared. Lopez looked at Marisol and suddenly decided. He had plenty of money, stolen from his father-in-law. He had a new identity. Why get involved in more adventures? So, did he really like my mom? Olivia exclaimed in surprise. "Well, I suppose so," the lawyer said. "I don't think he's capable of strong emotions, but he probably felt some sympathy for your mom, Marisol." Out of habit, Lopez continued to pilfer money from his new wife, small amounts without making much effort. He continued to have affairs with other women because, after all, old habits die hard. Then he unexpectedly ran into his former father-in-law. It was a disaster. Due to a completely idiotic coincidence, Lopez arrived at the same place as his former relative, who was having a meeting at that exact moment. Hugo fled in disgrace, remembering the older man's gaze. It felt as though that gaze was searing his soul. Lopez wasn't even sure if the man recognized him, but fear never left him, not even in his dreams. Hugo Lopez lost his appetite, started twitching at every sound. It was time to go on the run again. And then an explosion rocked the factory. What a gift from fate, Hugo thought, and arranged his own demise. And then he fled back to his criminal friends. Boss. He started as a regular Alfonso and ended up transitioning from a scammer to a criminal. Is that right? Olivia whistled. Well, yes, he's a true criminal. The lawyer nodded with a reproachful shake of his head. But you're right in a way. That's the kind of person he is incapable of love or compassion. Lopez spent all those months, after his supposed death, living at that very base where they exploited enslaved labor from abducted people. He probably ate well and slept without a care, Alberto reflected to himself. Familiar streets came into view outside the car window. Alberto breathed a sigh of relief. The hometown felt even cozier after their time apart. Boss, it's so beautiful here. Olivia pressed the window button, letting in a cool, fresh breeze. Let's go straight to my mom after you wrap up the case, and then we can head to the office. Garcia gave Olivia a surprised look. Are you planning to keep working with me? Of course, What a strange question. Olivia rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a water bottle. Let's do another investigation sometime. And do you think I run a detective agency? The lawyer retorted, annoyed. Most of the time, we deal with routine tasks, drafting lawsuits and agreements, preparing for trials, and so on. Think 10 times, lawyer, whether you are ready for that. Olivia replied. I am, the girl said. I enjoy working with you. Olivia tugged at Alberto's sleeve, and he frowned. What's up? Are you upset about something? She leaned closer. Why do you have that look on your face? In that moment, she looked particularly like an inquisitive puppy. Garcia sighed, giving in once again. Everything's fine. Finally, the partners arrived at Marisol Alonso's house. Mom, you won't believe what we found out. Olivia planted a kiss on Marisol's cheek and immediately rushed to the kitchen to inspect the fridge. Boss, are you hungry? She shouted from there. I'll quickly make some sandwiches. And Alberto will start explaining, okay. If he forgets something, I'll fill in. Olivia raised her head. We investigated together, from beginning to end. I even witnessed a real raid on a criminal hideout. Garcia paled under Marisol's stern gaze. A raid on a criminal hideout? Alberto? You dragged my daughter into a dangerous place? Is that right? Marisol's voice trembled. Well, because she stuck to me like candy. Garcia mentally yelled and took a deep breath. You see, Marisol, Olivia exaggerates slightly. It wasn't all that scary. While the assistant made sandwiches, the lawyer began his story. Marisol's face alternated between flushing and paling as she listened to the man. At some point, it seemed like she might faint. Mom, I was shocked too. You lived with that scoundrel for so many years. Alberto, this is some kind of waking nightmare. And here's another thing. How do we deal with all the documents now? I was married to a completely different person, it turns out. According to the documents, I was married to Carlos Alonso. We will sort everything out. Don't worry. The marriage will be declared invalid. But we'll discuss this together. Choose a time for a visit and come to my office. Yes, okay. Marisol pondered. But what will happen to the real Alonso now? He has no apartment, no job. I think first and foremost, he needs to understand that he has nothing to fear now. He spent 5 years in captivity. According to what the investigator told me, there were about 50 people working at that base. I can't say exactly what their work entailed because the investigation is ongoing. But believe me, it was hard labor. There was even a small graveyard on the base. People simply couldn't endure such harsh conditions. They were fed meagerly, and efforts were made to break them mentally. Each of these people ended up there against their will. You see, Marisol, they lured some with promises of good jobs, and others they drugged and kidnapped. This criminal group targeted lonely individuals who no one would ever come looking for. Moreover, every time they used the prisoner's documents, they built an entire business on this. So, changing identity is so popular. Marisol was taken aback. How inhumane. How inhumane all of this is. It's horrifying. I agree. You know, Marisol, I'm very glad you came to me with this problem. In fact, this group had been under investigation for quite some time. But if it weren't for the case of the missing Alonso, who knows when all of this would have come to an end. And every day, every hour, it's unbearable torture. And now these people are free. I suppose I will consider this case the most successful in my career. And Garcia smiled. And you also got a wonderful assistant. Isn't that right, boss? Olivia added cheerfully. Daughter. Well, how immodest. Marisol murmured helplessly. Outside, it was a sunny day, and the bus came to a stop at the terminal. Along with the crowd, a slim, blond man stepped onto the street, checking the address on his phone. He headed towards a small street cafe. A middle-aged woman with red hair was sitting at a table, absent-mindedly stirring her straw in a glass of juice. Hello, are you Marisol? The woman smiled, looking into his bright blue eyes. Hello, Carlos. It's very nice to meet you. Yes, nice to meet you too. The man sat very upright on the chair, his movements revealing his stiffness. I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very comfortable in open spaces yet, but I think it will pass soon. I'm sure it will. And I'm confident of that too. Marisol, I really want to thank you. I understand that everything that happened was a random sequence of events, but if it weren't for you, I would still be there. The woman waved her hands. Stop right there. I had no contribution to this. Absolutely none. The entire investigation was led by our wonderful lawyer, Alberto Garcia. By the way, I called him too. He should be arriving soon. Carlos, tell me, how have things been for you? Did you manage to achieve anything? The man sighed, but it was a light and unburdened sigh. I won't sue the new owners of my former apartment. These people are not to blame for falling into the clutches of a con artist. As for my mother, she's also under investigation now, implicated as an accomplice. I don't know what will happen to her next, and honestly, Marisol, I don't really care. But I was lucky to find a job in your city. Alonso smiled with an open and clear smile. The deputy director of the factory played a significant role in that. You know, I understand that he feels guilty for being involved in the deception. He says he could never have expected such behavior from Lopez. He knew Hugo was cunning, but he never thought he could stoop so low. Well, in general, I'm ready to start afresh in a new city. But what about your accommodation? Marisol asked with concern. Well, I'm not exactly young, but I'm not that old either. I'm sure I can earn enough for a new apartment. I'll do my best. The most important thing is freedom. It seems that only after experiencing hell can you truly appreciate life. And your family, your daughters. You did inform them that you're alive, right? Yes. Carlos casually waved his hand. It seems that news didn't exactly delight them. They were probably counting on a good inheritance. I'm so sorry. Tears glistened in Marisol's eyes. Alonso thought that he had nothing to feel sorry about. Yes, life had thrown numerous blows his way, but now he was ready to forget the past and simply move forward. When I receive my first paycheck, I will definitely invite you for dinner, Carlos Alonso unexpectedly declared. I'd be delighted to accept your invitation. They chatted carelessly at the cafe table. Nearby, a car stopped, and two people got out. A tall guy with wavy hair and a petite, red-haired girl. Boss, can we consider this a date? What on earth? Why are you talking nonsense again? The girl wearily rubbed her forehead. How much longer do I have to take care of you? The man abruptly stopped and looked intently at his companion. Well, and who asked you to take care of me at all? I might not need that. Don't make things up. You like me. Why on earth wouldn't you need that? You're acting like a fool, ready to miss out on your own happiness. She fixed her tousled, wavy hair. I'm older than you. I'm a bore. The man informed her. I know that. So what? Olivia turned back and took his arm. Let's go on a date. Look, Mom and Alonso are sitting at the table. Let's go. Garcia, the lawyer, surrendered, sensing that he had lost this battle with flying colors.